We all know what a disaster looks like. We see them in the news. If you're unfortunate, you might have lived through one. But the reality of disasters is very different. I've travelled a lot to work with people tackling disasters, and I've seen that they're very different to the way the media present them. Firstly, we think of big, newsworthy disasters hitting the headlines, but the data shows that a huge majority of disasters are smaller, never making the news. Most disasters are everyday, unreported and ignored. Secondly, we think of them as happening almost in an instant, but actually all the evidence shows that disasters result from the way that societies and communities have developed over years, decades or even longer. Disasters may seem sudden, but there's history behind them. And that leads to the most disturbing discovery. The impacts of disasters are the result of the way that we organise our societies. Disasters don't just happen, they're made. I'll show you what I mean with a few examples I've come across in my work. In the West African country of Benin, next door to Nigeria, on the streets of the commercial capital, people sell petrol from the roadside, siphoning it from huge glass bottles into motor scooter tanks. This is pretty scary. It's hot on those streets. The petrol in the jars kind of bubbles like it might explode. It's there because it's imported illegally across the border from Nigeria and sold duty-free. People buzzing round the city on motor scooters and in taxis are pretty poor, so the opportunity for cheap fuel can't be turned down. Every so often the authorities clamp down on this illegal trade, so people have to hide the fuel. And that's what drives disasters in the city, because if you hide your fuel in your wooden shack and the volatile petrol ignites, the shacks go up in flames, fires spread across the city. So, the domino effect of the economic pressures people face, leading to the illegal petrol trade and then to the authorities cracking down, meaning fuels hidden in incredibly flammable wooden shacks, drives local disasters. Another continent, Asia. The Nepalese capital, Kathmandu, is vulnerable to major earthquakes, the last having struck in 1934. But when we interviewed Dan Badur, a rickshaw rider on the city's streets, he said the things that concerned him most were the fumes and pollution which sometimes made him ill, the risk of accidents in the chaotic traffic, and the local seasonal flooding on the cheap low-lying land where people like him had to live, their houses flooded, their possessions damaged. These were disasters he faced from day to day. He said there was nothing they could do about the possibility of an earthquake. He knew it would happen. In fact, it did in 2015, a year after we spoke, but it wasn't high on his priority list. And even a newsworthy global disaster's effects are felt locally. The 2008 financial crash had devastating effects on the economies of many rich countries. At the time I was working in a much poorer country, Zambia, but even there the domino pieces tumbled. World interest rates and commodity price hikes hit even this remote African country. People told me food and fuel prices doubled and even quadrupled, making the poor even poorer. I've come across a lot of stories like this in my work, which have made me realise more and more that everyday disasters have a big effect on many people's lives, even though they don't get reported or recorded. But is this true globally? How can we find out if the only people who know are those experiencing them? Suppose you could gather information from people in cities, towns and villages right across the world about how everyday disasters affect them. I got involved in a project trying to do just that, consulting many thousands of people facing these regular shocks. How did that work? What did we discover? Find out in the next video. If you found this video useful in understanding disasters, subscribe to this channel as we explore disaster makers and check out the Disaster Makers book.